The American West of the 19th century was a crucible of conflict and transformation, a region where the nation's westward expansion collided with the enduring cultures of indigenous peoples. At the heart of this tumultuous era stands the Battle of the Little Bighorn, also called the Battle of the Greasy Grass and Custer's Last Stand, a cataclysmic event that continues to shape the American consciousness. Fought on June 25, 1876, near the Little Bighorn River in Montana Territory, this battle pitted the U.S. Army, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, against a formidable coalition of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors. The outcome, a decisive victory for the Native American alliance and the annihilation of Custer's 7th Cavalry, marked a turning point in the ongoing conflict between white settlers and indigenous inhabitants, as well as a fulcrum in the twists and tides of frontier lore. This is that story. The history of the Little Bighorn and the bloodshed that would one day flow down the riverbed begins with the European exploration of the region. In 1805, a fur trader named Francois Antoine Larocque encountered a Crow encampment near the Yellowstone River. During his exploration, he witnessed the Crow people hunting bison along the river, later dubbed the Small Horn. 2 years later, another fur trader, Manuel Lisa, established Fort Raymond near the convergence of the Yellowstone and Bighorn rivers, approximately 40 miles north of the future battlefield, to conduct trade with the Crow tribes. The region was first formally recognized in the 1851 Treaty of Fort Laramie. As the 19th century progressed, animosity between the various indigenous tribes of the Great Plains and the arriving settlers intensified. This rising tension culminated in a series of conflicts known as the Sioux Wars, spanning from 1854 to 1890. While some Native nations consented to relocate to diminishing reservations, others resolutely resisted. The valley's terrain itself is varied, composed of rugged cliffs, rolling hills, the Little Bighorn River, and surrounding grasslands with diverse plant life. The Lakota Sioux, Dakota Sioux, Cheyenne, and other Plains indigenous groups referred to the Little Bighorn Valley as Greasy Grass. However, contemporary accounts from those present labeled it the Valley of Chieftains. In 1868, seeking to prevent conflict through provisions rather than force, the United States government forged an agreement with the Lakota, Cheyenne, and other Plains tribes at Fort Laramie, Wyoming. This treaty designated a vast expanse of eastern Wyoming as a permanent homeland for these nations, with a government promise of protection from harm inflicted by U.S. citizens. On May 7th of that year, the Little Bighorn Valley was incorporated into the newly formed Crow Indian Reservation, encompassing their ancestral territory. This came after decades of the Crow and Sioux tribes engaging in frequent clashes with themselves, on top of the festering wounds within the relationship of the Sioux and the United States government. However, this newfound peace proved fleeting. The discovery of gold within the Black Hills, a sacred region encompassed by the newly established reservation, in 1874 ignited a frenzy. Thousands of prospectors rushed into the area, blatantly disregarding the terms of the Fort Laramie Treaty. Despite military efforts to deter them, the influx of gold seekers persisted. Attempts to purchase the Black Hills from the tribes to avert conflict also failed. In response, the Lakota and Cheyenne abandoned the reservation and initiated attacks on nearby settlements and travelers. By December 1875, the government's Indian Affairs Commissioner issued an ultimatum, demanding the tribes return to their reservation by January 31, 1876, or face military intervention. When the tribes refused to comply, the U.S. Army was dispatched to enforce the order.
Introducing Business Essentials, a powerful combination of business checking and card payment processing from U.S. Bank.
From the onset of 1876, catalyst after catalyst erupted in the northern plains as the showdown between the United States military forces and the Sioux became imminent. One incendiary after another made sure to keep the leadership on both sides of the conflict primed for battle. On January 31st, the U.S. government's aforementioned mandate for Native Americans residing off reservations to return to their designated territories failed. Sitting Bull and his followers disregarded this directive. The following day, Interior Secretary Zachariah Chandler informed War Secretary William Belknap that the Lakota Sioux situation now fell under the jurisdiction of the military for appropriate action. By February 8th, General Phil Sheridan issued confidential orders to Generals Terry and Crook, initiating military operations against the hostile Native Americans. On March 3rd, Bloody Knife, a former U.S. Indian scout, was enlisted as a civilian scout by the U.S. quartermaster at Fort Abraham Lincoln for the impending Great Sioux Campaign against Sitting Bull. The campaign gained traction on April 3rd, when Colonel John Gibbon's Montana column departed Fort Ellis in pursuit of Sitting Bull. 6 days later, Lieutenant James Bradley arrived at Crow Agency near Livingston, Montana, to recruit Crow Scouts for the U.S. Army's campaign against their traditional adversaries, the Lakota, under the leadership of Sitting Bull. By April 10th, 25 Crow individuals had enlisted as U.S. Indian Scouts to aid Colonel Gibbon in locating Sitting Bull's allied Lakota and Cheyenne. Between April 26th and May 9th, an additional 30 Arikara Scouts joined the campaign against Sitting Bull. These scouts were tasked with gathering intelligence on the Lakota and Cheyenne, transporting vital messages and mail, and identifying suitable campgrounds. On May 17th, Colonel Gibbon attempted to cross the Yellowstone River to the south side for an attack on a nearby village, but opted to remain north after losing several horses in the attempt. Simultaneously, General Alfred Terry's Dakota column departed Fort Abraham Lincoln in pursuit of Sitting Bull, believed to be near the Little Missouri River, with Custer commanding the 7th Cavalry. Finally, on May 29th, General George Crook's Wyoming column left Fort Fetterman in pursuit of Sitting Bull. By June 2nd, General Crook had instructed his civilian scouts to establish contact with his Crow allies. As June of '76 arrived, dusk was quickly approaching the Little Bighorn Valley. While the United States Army was making strides in their reconnaissance, Sitting Bull and his fellow Lakota warriors continued to sneak through the shadows of the prairie. Their next goal? Engage in the long-time tradition of the Sundance, the next of which was right around the corner. The Sundance stands as a central spiritual practice for the indigenous peoples of the North American plains. For these nomadic communities, this gathering served as a time for reunion and renewal, reinforcing their fundamental beliefs about the cosmos and the spirit world through acts of personal and collective sacrifice. Traditionally held annually during the late spring or early summer, the Sundance coincided with the return of vast buffalo herds, providing sustenance for the hundreds who participated. The precise origins of the Sundance remain shrouded in mystery, though many tribal accounts trace its roots to antiquity. By the late 19th century, the Sundance, with its diverse forms, had spread across numerous tribes, stretching from Canada to the southern plains of the United States. This ritual exemplifies a global spiritual tradition of seeking divine power and wisdom. Initially, the Sundance may have been a solitary ordeal, undertaken by a few dedicated individuals. Over time, it evolved into a communal event, guided by tribal and religious leaders, incorporating elaborate ceremonies to amplify participants' prayers and offerings. The most elaborate Sundances unfolded within or near large settlements, requiring up to a year of preparation for those who vowed to participate. These individuals, along with their spiritual mentors and extended families, played crucial roles in the preparations, providing essential supplies such as ornate clothing, horses, food, and other goods. As the community assembled, specific individuals, often members of particular religious societies, constructed a sacred structure featuring a central pole symbolizing a connection to the divine sun. Those who participated in the Sundance typically did so to fulfill a solemn promise, or seek spiritual strength and understanding. They embarked on a sustained period of dancing, punctuated by rest, abstaining from food and drink. In certain tribes, participants endured additional acts of self-denial beyond fasting and exertion, while others viewed such practices as excessive. When practiced, self-sacrifice often involved piercing the body. Mentors or ritual leaders would insert thin objects through a small incision on the chest or back, attaching a heavy weight, such as a buffalo skull, with leather cords. The dancer would then move until exhaustion or the skin tore free. In the late spring of 1876, the Lakota and Cheyenne prepared a Sundance to be attended by some individuals who had left their designated reservations. Around June 5th, near Rosebud Creek in Montana, Sitting Bull, who had been the spiritual leader of the Hunkpapa Lakota and responsible for such traditions, reportedly experienced a vision of soldiers descending upon his camp like a swarm of grasshoppers. To the United States officials, it appeared to be a threat of black magic. For the Plains tribes, it was a moment of hope. As the final Sundance of Sitting Bull and his folk was underway, their adversaries were planning their next move. Simultaneous to the June 5th festivities, the U.S. military was executing a summer campaign to compel the Lakota and Cheyenne to return to their reservations.
Discover Braun Series 9 Pro Plus. You take one stroke, Braun takes 5.
Employing infantry and cavalry in a coordinated three-pronged assault. In the spring of 1876, the U.S. Army launched a three-pronged campaign against the Lakota and Cheyenne. Colonel John Gibbon's forces, primarily cavalry and infantry, departed from Fort Ellis, Montana, to patrol the Yellowstone River. Simultaneously, Brigadier General George Crook's larger command, composed of multiple infantry and cavalry units themselves, advanced northward from Fort Fetterman, Wyoming, towards the Powder River region. General Alfred Terry's column, including Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer's renowned 7th Cavalry, infantry, and artillery, set forth from Fort Abraham Lincoln, Dakota Territory. This expedition, supported by a substantial supply train, aimed to converge with Crook's forces. Additional troops and a steamboat carrying supplies reinforced Terry's command. The 7th Cavalry, a seasoned unit with many Civil War veterans, had a complex history. While their officers possessed combat experience, the regiment's reputation was marred by the infamous attack on Black Kettle's Cheyenne camp. By the time of the Little Bighorn campaign, the cavalry was a mix of experienced soldiers and inexperienced recruits. Despite ample supplies, evidence suggests many troopers suffered from malnutrition. Leadership challenges also plagued the 7th Cavalry. Colonel Custer assumed command in the absence of the regimental commander, who was on detached duty. Officer shortages, a result of the Army's rigid promotion system and other assignments, further weakened the unit's leadership. Custer's troopers were primarily armed with two standard-issue firearms, the single-shot Springfield carbine and the Colt revolver. Unlike their predecessors, they did not carry sabers. While some officers and scouts opted for more advanced personal weapons, the majority of soldiers were equipped uniformly. Each trooper carried a substantial amount of ammunition for both weapons. The Springfield carbine was selected as the Army's official firearm after rigorous testing against various domestic and foreign models. This breech-loading rifle was designed for both infantry and cavalry, demonstrating versatility and effectiveness. Despite the popularity of lever-action repeating rifles, military experts favored the Springfield due to its superior range, stopping power, and consistent rate of fire. Additionally, the government owned the design patent, enabling cost-effective production at a time of limited military funding. Historians argue that the focus on a single-shot weapon was not due to concerns about ammunition shortages, but rather a strategic decision based on the anticipated nature of future conflicts. The Indian Wars were seen as a smaller theater of operations, compared to potential wars against major European powers. On the flip side of the battlefield, the Lakota and Cheyenne warriors who confronted Custer's troops employed a diverse array of weapons, blending traditional and modern technologies. Alongside traditional tools like war clubs and spears, many warriors wielded firearms obtained through trade or other means. Common among these firearms were muzzle-loading muskets, often provided by the U.S. government as part of treaty agreements. While less common, some native fighters possessed rifled muskets, remnants of the Civil War. However, it was the more advanced repeating rifles, such as the Henry and Spencer models, and breech loaders like the Sharps, that were highly prized. These firearms offered greater firepower and accuracy. Despite their preference for modern weapons, the Lakota and Cheyenne also relied on the familiar bow and arrow. While shorter in range than firearms, arrows could inflict significant wounds. Acquiring firearms and ammunition was a challenge for Sitting Bull's forces specifically. Through trade, both legal and illicit, they managed to obtain these vital supplies. Horses, mules, and buffalo hides were often exchanged for guns and ammunition. Intelligence reports indicated that Sitting Bull's warriors were amassing a formidable arsenal, including a substantial number of repeating rifles. War was on the horizon. In the summer of 1876, the U.S. military initiated a three-pronged campaign to subdue Native American tribes residing in the Bighorn and Powder River regions. General George Crook led one of these forces, departing from Fort Fetterman, Wyoming, with a diverse group of soldiers, civilians, and Native allies. Their objective was to locate and compel the Lakota and Cheyenne to return to designated reservations. Crook's expedition retraced the infamous Bozeman Trail, a route marked by past conflicts. By early June, his troops reached the Tongue River, where they encountered resistance from the Native Americans. Despite warnings from the Lakota leader Crazy Horse, Crook pressed forward, underestimating the opposition. Reinforced by Crow and Shoshone warriors, eager to confront their longtime enemies, Crook's force continued its advance. However, the campaign was fraught with challenges. A crucial error in intelligence led Crook to believe a major Native American encampment was located on the Rosebud Creek. This miscalculation, coupled with the unexpected ferocity of the Native resistance, set the stage for a decisive confrontation. As darkness shrouded the landscape on June 16th, nearly 1,000 Lakota and Cheyenne warriors embarked on a nighttime journey to confront Crook's forces. After hours upon hours of travel, they made contact with Crook's scouts early the following morning. Unprepared for the impending attack, Crook's troops were caught off guard as they rested along the Rosebud Creek. The initial exchange of gunfire was mistaken for hunting activity, but the escalating intensity quickly revealed the true nature of the threat. The Lakota and Cheyenne, occupying a commanding position on the high ground, launched a determined assault against Crook's native allies. Despite being outnumbered, the Crow and Shoshone fought fiercely, providing crucial time for Crook to organize his defenses. The ensuing battle was a chaotic struggle, marked by sporadic skirmishes and desperate charges across a wide expanse. While the soldiers managed to repel enemy attacks, they were unable to gain a decisive advantage. To counter the growing threat, Crook implemented a defensive strategy. He ordered a portion of his forces to secure a strategic position south of the creek, while another group advanced against the Lakota and Cheyenne.
Summit Series was never just made for mountains. It was made for those who know the value.
However, progress was hindered by intense enemy fire from elevated positions. In an attempt to accelerate their progress, Crook dispatched Captain Anson Mills and his cavalry squadron in a mounted charge. This aggressive maneuver temporarily disrupted the Native American lines, forcing them to retreat. Capitalizing on this advantage, Mills launched a second charge, driving the enemy further back. However, Crook's strategy shifted, and he ordered Mills to abandon the offensive and establish a defensive position alongside other units. While these tactical maneuvers unfolded, acts of heroism and survival emerged. A Cheyenne warrior was rescued from battlefield by his sister. Additionally, the cavalry observed the native warriors' adept fighting style, characterized by their ability to effectively utilize cover and concealment while mounted. Despite the initial successes, Crook's forces failed to inflict decisive damage on the enemy. The Lakota and Cheyenne, employing hit-and-run tactics, proved elusive and resilient. Misinterpreting the enemy's strategy, Crook believed they were protecting a nearby village, prompting him to redirect his forces in a search that would prove fruitless. While Crook's main force grappled with the initial assault, Lieutenant Colonel William B. Royal faced a growing crisis. Leading a cavalry detachment, Royal pursued the enemy forces that had attacked the camp. But as he advanced, the Lakota and Cheyenne concentrated their fire on his troops, threatening to encircle them. Despite orders to retreat, Royal initially struggled to disengage due to the intensity of the fighting. The situation worsened for Royal's command as they attempted to withdraw. However, the timely arrival of Crow and Shoshone scouts provided crucial support, helping to stem the tide of the enemy attacks. Eventually, Royal managed to regroup his forces and establish a defensive position. Crook, recognizing the perilous situation facing Royal's men, dispatched reinforcements under the command of aforementioned Captain Anson Mills. Although Mills arrived too late to directly assist Royal, his presence contributed to the eventual withdrawal of the Lakota and Cheyenne forces. The Battle of the Rosebud concluded in the early afternoon. While the U.S. Army successfully held its ground, the engagement was exceptionally costly in terms of casualties. The Lakota and Cheyenne, renowned for their fierce resistance, inflicted significant losses on Crook's forces. The battle also highlighted the invaluable contributions of the Crow and Shoshone allies, who played a pivotal role in preventing a potential disaster. Despite claiming a tactical victory, Crook's position remained precarious. With dwindling supplies and numerous wounded, he made the difficult decision to retreat to a safer location. The battle marked a turning point in the conflict, with the worst of the worst still lurking in the shadows over the northern plains. In June 1876, the Lakota and Cheyenne established a large encampment within the Little Bighorn Valley. Days later, General Alfred Terry, commanding U.S. forces, received intelligence placing Sitting Bull's camp along the Rosebud River. A strategic meeting was convened aboard the steamer Far West at the confluence of the Rosebud and the Yellowstone River. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer and his 7th Cavalry were tasked with pursuing Sitting Bull upstream. A reporter, Mark Kellogg, accompanied Custer, foreshadowing the tragic outcome with his final dispatch. Meanwhile, General Terry joined forces with Colonel John Gibbon, and their combined command moved westward along the Yellowstone River before entering the Bighorn River Valley. Custer's Native American scouts reached a strategic vantage point overlooking the Little Bighorn Valley on June 24th. From this elevated position, they observed a vast pony herd and evidence of a large Native American village. However, due to factors including fatigue in the early hour, subsequent attempts to locate these landmarks were unsuccessful. The situation was further compounded by the regiment's visible cooking fires, which inadvertently revealed their position to the enemy Lakota and Cheyenne. On June 24th, a solemn ritual unfolded within the Lakota and Cheyenne encampment. A group of young warriors vowed to sacrifice their lives in defense of their community. Concurrently, Lieutenant Colonel Custer and his 7th Cavalry halted their advance at a location now known as Busby, Montana. After dispatching scouts to reconnoiter the Little Bighorn Valley, Custer led his troops on a night march towards the Wolf Mountains. Originally planning a surprise attack, Custer altered his course upon learning of potential enemy awareness. Dividing his force into 3 battalions, he assigned command to Major Marcus Reno, Captain Frederick Benteen, and himself. A support unit was tasked with guarding the supply train. Custer's scouts reported an unusually large Native American village. Despite these warnings, Custer remained focused on preventing the enemy's dispersal and opted for a daylight attack. As the fateful day dawned, an ominous atmosphere prevailed. A Crow scout called Half Yellowface offered a somber prediction, foreshadowing the tragic events to come. "You and I are going home today, by a road we do not know," were his final words. The U.S. Army embarked on its campaign against Native Americans with a fundamental miscalculation of the enemy's strength. Relying on government estimates, which grossly underestimated the number of warriors, military leaders, including Custer, Terry, and Gibbon, were unaware of the true scale of the opposition. While these initial scouts' assessments accurately reflected the number of Lakota who had left the reservation in protest, they failed to account for the thousands of additional warriors who had joined them for the summer buffalo hunt. Custer's tactical decisions were influenced by these flawed assumptions. His primary objective was to prevent the Native Americans from dispersing, rather than engaging in a direct confrontation. This urgency was underscored by the dispatch of a bugler, John Martin, to request reinforcements and ammunition as Custer and his men approached the massive Native American village. Martin's desperate plea would later solidify his place in history as one of the last individuals to witness Custer alive. Custer's initial assessment of the Native American encampment was based on a mistaken assumption that the warriors were still asleep. Observations from a distance revealed a pony herd and women tending to domestic chores, leading him to underestimate the enemy's strength. Despite warnings from his Crow scouts about the village's size, Custer persisted in his belief that the encampment was lightly defended. His decision to release the scouts shortly before the battle further compounded the situation.
"These hands are working hands. My hands are the most important tools I have. You need to take care of them." That's where O'Keefe.
Custer's tactical plan relied on the assumption of support from a subordinate, Major Benteen. The use of rifle volleys as a signal for assistance was a common military practice. Subsequent investigations confirmed that Benteen and his men had heard these distress signals. Originally, Custer intended to inspect the village before launching an attack. However, discovery of his troops' tracks by native scouts forced him to accelerate his timeline. The presence of fresh pony tracks, indicating heightened enemy awareness, reinforced the urgency of an immediate assault. Fearing the potential dispersal of the village, Custer opted for an immediate attack rather than risking a prolonged engagement with smaller, more mobile enemy forces. Custer's approach also centered on capturing non-combatant members of the Native American community as a means of coercing warriors' surrender. By seizing women, children, and the elderly, he believed he could force the warriors to comply with government relocation orders. This strategy was rooted in the assumption that the threat to their families would compel the warriors to surrender, rather than risk their lives in defense of their homes. Custer's military philosophy, as outlined in his writings, emphasized the strategic importance of positioning camps near Native American villages. He believed that the proximity of non-combatants would serve as a deterrent to hostilities, as the potential harm to women and children would discourage aggressive actions. Lieutenant Edward Godfrey, a member of Custer's command, speculated that the decision to approach the village from the east was influenced by the expectation that non-combatants would flee in a northerly direction. The Native American warriors were acutely aware of the potential consequences of engaging in combat near their non-combatants. This was demonstrated when a detachment of U.S. cavalry posed a direct threat to the safety of fleeing Native American families, prompting a significant portion of the warrior forces to abandon their initial engagement and return to the village. Despite their retreat, the victory cry wasn't anywhere imminent for the United States troops. In fact, it couldn't be any further away. But that didn't matter to Custer and company. It was time for the final offensive, one that would etch he and his men into the infamous history books forever. The initial assault on the Native American encampment was launched by Major Reno's detachment. Acting on orders from Lieutenant Colonel Custer, Reno's troops crossed the Little Bighorn River and encountered fierce resistance from a substantial Lakota and Cheyenne force. Contrary to expectations, the Native Americans fought tenaciously, refusing to retreat. Reno's men advanced across the open terrain, utilizing the riverbank's tree line for cover. Initially forming two columns, they eventually deployed into a single line as they closed in on the village. The dense vegetation obscured the encampment's size and layout until the troops were in close proximity. The initial engagement took place with the Hunkpapa Sioux, a prominent Lakota tribe. Both Reno and Custer underestimated the scale of the village due to limited visibility. As Reno's forces emerged into the open, they deployed their Native American scouts to protect their vulnerable left flank. The realization of the village's immense size and the growing intensity of the enemy's resistance prompted Reno to halt his advance. Deploying his troops in a skirmish line, a tactic that reduced firepower, he engaged the Lakota and Cheyenne warriors. The ensuing battle was fierce, with the Native Americans focusing their attacks on Reno's exposed left flank. Overwhelmed by the sheer number of attackers, Reno ordered a retreat to the protective cover of the riverbank. The Native Americans pursued relentlessly, attempting to dislodge Reno's forces through a combination of gunfire and conflagration. The battle reached a critical phase as Reno's men found themselves trapped and under siege. In the midst of the chaos, Reno's Arikara scout was mortally wounded, creating a scene of carnage and confusion. Reno, momentarily stunned, issued conflicting orders to his men before leading a disorganized retreat towards the river. The retreat was marked by intense close-quarters fighting, resulting in significant casualties. After a harrowing escape, Reno's forces regrouped on higher ground, later known as Reno Hill. They were joined by Captain Benteen's detachment, which had been summoned by a message from Custer. Despite the urgent tone of the message, Benteen initially hesitated to leave his position, believing his troops were needed elsewhere. Reno, however, insisted on waiting for the arrival of supplies before considering further action. With the arrival of additional troops and resources, Reno's forces established a defensive position on the newfound higher ground. Despite hearing intense gunfire from the north, indicating Custer's ongoing battle, Benteen prioritized consolidating Reno's position rather than advancing to his aid. This decision would later be subject to scrutiny. Captain Thomas Weir led a reconnaissance mission to locate Custer's position. From an elevated vantage point, Weir observed the vast Native American encampment. The intensity of the fighting suggested that Custer's battle might have already concluded. Weir's observations, including the sight of warriors firing upon fallen soldiers, painted a grim picture of the situation. As the battle progressed, the remaining companies joined forces with Reno and Benteen on Weir Ridge. Facing relentless pressure from a growing number of Native American warriors, they were forced to retreat back to the relative safety of Reno Hill. The soldiers dug rudimentary trenches for protection as the battle raged around them. Despite fierce resistance, including a counterattack by Benteen, the troops were unable to gain a decisive advantage. The exact circumstances surrounding Custer's final stand remained shrouded in mystery, as all members of his battalion perished in the battle. While accounts from surviving Native Americans offer some insights, these narratives are often conflicting and incomplete. The soldiers stationed on Reno Hill heard the sounds of battle, indicating that Custer's force was engaged with the enemy. However, the full extent of the disaster only became apparent when General Terry arrived 2 days later. The subsequent examination of the battlefield revealed the grim reality of Custer's defeat. The remnants of his command were scattered across a wide area, with evidence of fierce resistance and brutal aftermath. The bodies of Custer's men bore the marks of a brutal encounter, and many were disfigured beyond recognition. The fallen soldiers were hastily buried at the site of their deaths. Custer's body displayed evidence of multiple gunshot wounds, including a fatal chest wound and a head wound. While the exact circumstances of the head wound remain unclear, some theories suggest the possibility of suicide or post-mortem injury. The discovery of Custer's body atop a hill, later named Last Stand Hill, became a powerful symbol of the tragedy.
You want to look good? You want to feel good? You got to snack good.
Tasty.
Do you love to make things work? You'll thrive at Vaughn College.
A Crow scout who had accompanied Custer provided a first-hand account of the battle, suggesting that the cavalry attempted to cross the river but were forced to retreat. This narrative aligns with Custer's reputation for aggressive tactics and the physical evidence found at the battle site. The circumstances surrounding Custer's death remain cloaked in uncertainty, with various accounts offering conflicting narratives. While one version suggests Custer was killed while attempting to cross the river, another account places his final stand on higher ground. The identity of the individual who delivered the fatal blow to Custer is also contested, with multiple individuals claiming responsibility. Following the initial engagement with Major Reno's forces, the majority of the Lakota and Cheyenne warriors shifted their focus towards Custer's command. The precise route taken by Custer and his men remains a subject of ongoing debate itself. One theory posits that Custer continued his advance along the river before turning north and ascending a ridge. From this vantage point, he could observe Reno's attack on the village. It is believed that a portion of Custer's troops attempted to cross the river, but were met with fierce resistance from the Native American defenders. In the early 20th century, ethnologist Edward Curtis undertook a comprehensive investigation of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, conducting interviews with Native American participants and military personnel. His research, combined with archaeological evidence, led to new interpretations of the battle's course. Curtis's findings, based on accounts from both sides of the conflict, suggested that Custer's troops had attempted to cross the aforementioned river, but were met with the aforementioned overwhelming resistance. This forced retreat ultimately led to the tragic stand on Last Stand Hill. Subsequent archaeological discoveries, particularly the concentration of spent ammunition cartridges, supported the theory of a coordinated military maneuver involving multiple attack points. Regardless of what actually happened, though, the twilight of the battle was nearing, the end mere moments away. While George Armstrong Custer himself was lost to battle, the remnants of his men were struggling to pick up the pieces. The limited space available on the hilltop hampered the ability of Custer's forces to establish a defensible perimeter. The relentless attacks from the Native American warriors, particularly from the southeast, further compromised their position. Despite facing overwhelming odds, Custer's men fought with extraordinary courage, demonstrating a determination to resist until the end. However, the loss of command structure and the relentless onslaught of the enemy ultimately led to the annihilation of Custer's force. The Lakota and Cheyenne forces swiftly overwhelmed Custer's command, with most accounts indicating the battle lasted less than an hour. Native American testimonies describe a chaotic and intense engagement, marked by the rapid collapse of the cavalry's defensive position. The surprise charge, led by Crazy Horse and his warriors, coupled with the brutal efficiency of the ensuing melee, resulted in the annihilation of Custer's force. Captain Benteen, a key survivor in the Battle of the Little Bighorn, provided first-hand testimony about the chaotic nature of the engagement. Based on his observations, the battle devolved into a disorganized retreat, marked by a complete loss of discipline. The absence of defensive fortifications and the scattered distribution of bodies and horses further support this assessment of a panicked withdrawal. While the overall narrative of the battle depicts a chaotic and disorganized retreat, some accounts suggest that elements of Custer's command displayed remarkable courage and determination. Despite facing overwhelming odds, these soldiers fought fiercely, delaying the enemy advance and inflicting casualties of their own. However, the lack of coordinated leadership and the relentless pressure from the Native American warriors ultimately led to the outcome. Archaeological evidence suggests that Custer's force made a final stand on the hilltop, where they engaged in intense fighting before succumbing to the overwhelming numbers of their adversaries. The discovery of makeshift tools used to dispatch the wounded highlights the authenticity of the find. The aftermath of the battle witnessed a hasty burial of the fallen soldiers by their comrades. While markers have been erected to approximate the locations of these tragic losses, the precise details of their final moments remain shrouded in mystery. The discovery of multiple burial sites suggests that Custer's force was fragmented and overwhelmed by successive waves of attacks. Contemporary research challenges the traditional image of a heroic last stand, proposing instead a scenario of chaotic retreat and desperate resistance. The harsh realities of time and natural processes have obscured the battlefield, making it increasingly difficult to recover and identify the remains of those who perished that fateful day. The 7th Cavalry suffered catastrophic losses during the Battle of the Little Bighorn, with over half of its personnel killed or wounded. Among the fallen were numerous high-ranking officers, including Custer's close relatives. The companies directly under Custer's command were completely annihilated, with only a handful of survivors. The soldiers who participated in the defense of Reno Hill were recognized for their bravery with numerous medals of honor. While the enlisted men's actions were generally lauded, the decision made by the officers were subjected to intense scrutiny. Despite facing overwhelming odds and the horrors of warfare, the soldiers displayed remarkable courage and resilience. Accounts from both sides of the conflict paint a complex picture of the battle. While the Native Americans inflicted heavy casualties, they also acknowledged the bravery of their opponents. The war's brutality is evident in the treatment of the fallen, with both sides resorting to extreme measures in the heat of the battle. Determining the exact number of Native American casualties during the Battle of the Little Bighorn has proven challenging due to the inconsistent, often exaggerated nature of early accounts. While initial reports suggested a significant loss of life, Subsequent research and analysis has led to a more accurate estimate of the casualties. By cross-referencing various sources and identifying discrepancies in the data, historians have been able to create a more reliable record of those who perished in the battle. In addition to the soldiers, several civilians who were accompanying the 7th Cavalry perished in the conflict. These individuals, including family members, support staff, and journalists, found themselves caught in the crossfire of the battle. Furthermore, the Native American community suffered significant casualties, extending beyond the ranks of the warriors. Women and children were tragically killed during the fighting, highlighting the indiscriminate nature of the conflict. The battle's impact was profound and far-reaching, leaving a lasting legacy of loss and sorrow that can still be felt today. In the aftermath of their victory over Custer's forces, the Lakota and Cheyenne turned their attention to the remaining U.S. troops under the command of Reno and Benteen. The fierce fighting continued throughout the day and into the night, with Reno's forces enduring a relentless assault. The arrival of General Terry's column the following day forced the Native Americans to withdraw. The arrival of General Terry's forces marked the beginning of the recovery and burial process for the fallen soldiers of the 7th Cavalry. The wounded were evacuated to a nearby steamboat for transport to a military hospital, where they could receive specialized medical care.
Business tech that's bold, fresh, and delicious.
Get started at easycater.com.
For your next need-to-know moment, or your next, how will this affect me? And every, whoa, check this out.
The Crow Nation was deeply saddened by the defeat of Custer and his men. They mourned the loss of their allies and expressed concern about the potential repercussions for their own community. The end of the conflict brought a sense of relief and newfound peace to the Crow people, as they were no longer under constant threat from the Lakota. The news of the devastating defeat at the Little Bighorn reached the public on July 5th, when the steamer Far West arrived in Bismarck, carrying wounded soldiers and the first-hand accounts of the battle. The rapid transmission of this shocking news across the nation highlighted the speed and efficiency of the emerging communication networks. While the nation reeled from the news, the U.S. Army initiated an investigation into the circumstances surrounding the battle. However, the focus on caring for the wounded and protecting the reputations of the surviving officers initially hindered the inquiry. The news of the Battle of the Little Bighorn and the death of Lieutenant Colonel Custer spread rapidly across the nation. Within days of the initial reports, the tragic news had reached high-ranking military officials and the grieving widow. Elizabeth Custer, faced with the immense grief of her own loss, also had the difficult task of offering comfort to the other bereaved families. She emerged as a prominent figure in shaping the public's perception of the battle, working tirelessly to preserve her husband's legacy, albeit a much maligned one. The Battle of the Little Bighorn represented a significant turning point in the ongoing conflict between Native Americans and the U.S. government. The massive encampment of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors was forced to disperse due to dwindling supplies and the growing threat of retaliation. The retreat was marked by hardship and privation, as families fled their homes with limited provisions. The experience left a lasting impact on the survivors, particularly the younger generation, who were forced to assume adult responsibilities at a very young age. Following their victory at the Little Bighorn, the Lakota and Cheyenne tribes enjoyed a brief period of respite. However, the challenges of sustaining a large encampment without adequate supplies forced many warriors to return to the reservations. The U.S. military, while aware of the need for a swift and decisive response, delayed its counteroffensive for several months. The campaign to subdue the Native American resistance ultimately lasted nearly a year. The surrender of key leaders, including Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, marked the end of the conflict. The final engagement took place in May 1877, signaling the end of the Great Sioux War. The tragic death of Crazy Horse in 1877 marked a turning point in the ongoing conflict between the Lakota and the U.S. government. Despite diplomatic efforts to persuade Sitting Bull and his followers to return to the United States from Canada, the Lakota people resisted these overtures. However, facing increasing hardship and deprivation, a portion of the Lakota community eventually decided to surrender and return south of the border to their homeland. The subsequent years were marked by continued government pressure and the erosion of traditional Lakota cultures. The imposition of bans on religious practices and customs represented a significant assault on the Lakota people's way of life. The Ghost Dance movement emerged in the late 19th century as a spiritual and cultural response to the hardships faced by Native American communities. Originating among the Paiute people, the movement emphasized a return to traditional ways of life and the promise of a restored world. The Ghost Dance rapidly spread across various tribes, offering hope and solace during a time of profound change and adversity. The U.S. government viewed the movement with suspicion and fear, leading to increased military presence and surveillance of Native American communities. The tragic killing of Sitting Bull, the revered Lakota leader, further inflamed tensions and set the stage for the events that would culminate in the Wounded Knee Massacre. On December 29, 1890, a tragic event unfolded at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. U.S. soldiers opened fire on a Lakota Sioux encampment, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of Native Americans, including women and children. This massacre marked a horrific culmination of the U.S. government's efforts to suppress Native American resistance and forcibly assimilate indigenous peoples. The Black Hills region held immense cultural and spiritual significance for the Lakota people as well. However, the U.S. government, seeking to acquire the land for its mineral resources, coerced the Lakota into relinquishing their ancestral territory. Despite the forced cession, the Lakota people never relinquished their claim to the Black Hills, engaging in decades of legal and political battles to reclaim their homeland. The Supreme Court eventually acknowledged the unjust seizure of the land, but the Lakota people have continued to assert their sovereign rights, as nothing has been done. The Battle of the Little Bighorn stands as a pivotal moment in the history of the American West, marking a dramatic clash between Native American and U.S. forces. The resounding victory of the Lakota and Cheyenne tribes over Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer's 7th Cavalry Regiment temporarily reversed the tide of the Plains Wars. However, this triumph proved to be ephemeral. The U.S. government, determined to assert its authority, redoubled its efforts to subdue the Native American nations. The ensuing years witnessed a series of campaigns and policies aimed at confining Indigenous peoples to reservations and eradicating their traditional ways of life. The battle's legacy extends far beyond the immediate conflict, shaping the course of relations between Native Americans and the United States for generations. It serves as a potent reminder of the courage and resilience of the Plains tribes, as well as the complexities and injustices in the era of the Old West. It goes without saying, but the American frontier wouldn't be the same without the Battle of the Little Bighorn.
Summit Series was never just built for the mountains.